Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are in the final part 3 of our respiration unit. This is the most inclusive part of the unit. It's a little bit tricky, so if you need to stop it, rewind it, feel free. We'll start off, as always, with our main ideas. Our respiration is broken down in terms of gas exchange into 3. We have our external respiration, we have our internal, and we have our cellular respiration. Okay. Between our external, this is when air is being exchanged between the lungs alveoli. I'll include all the letters between the alveoli of the lungs and the capillaries of the circulatory system. This is actually going to be the pulmonary artery that it feeds back to before it gets pumped back to the heart and then to the rest of the body, which we'll talk about next unit in circulation. Internal respiration is where, after it's been pumped to all the cells, it goes from the capillaries to the cells. And then cellular respiration is where we have our glucose and our oxygen changing into CO2 and water and ATP, and that's where it's occurring in the mitochondria. So before we get started on the processes that allows it to be exchanged, we just need to talk about one term, hemoglobin. We abbreviate it HB. This is a transport protein, and it transports 3 different things. The main one that we think about when we think about hemoglobin is oxygen. So if it carries oxygen, we call it, so we'll say O2, and we call it oxyhemoglobin. And we abbreviate it HbO2. If it carries CO2, we call it carbaminohemoglobin. And its abbreviation is CO2. And then the last one is if it carries H+, and this is called reduced hemoglobin. And we say it's HHB. So the reason why it carries specific molecules we'll get into a little bit later. So let's talk about the first one, external respiration. So I'll do a few different colors here to get it going. We talked about this in the lab before. In order to bring in gases, we need to have that pressure lowered. So what happens is we'll say that this is oxygen, and we'll say green is CO2. So first of all, when we're breathing in, we have a lot of oxygen coming in, and there won't be as much oxygen in our blood because it's already been brought to our cells in order to use it. So with that being said, we have something that's called PO2, and that's the partial pressure. So it's the amount of partial pressure. So it's the amount of pressure that gas exerts. So since this has less on the inside due to diffusion, that gas is going to come and diffuse across our membrane from our lungs into our capillaries. Okay? Whereas CO2, since there's going to be a lot of CO2 coming back from our cells, it's a waste product of cellular respiration, and there won't be that much in our lungs because there was no waste product there. It's going to want to diffuse from area of high to low concentration to get out of the capillaries, and so that will give us a partial pressure as well. Partial pressure. So what that partial pressure just means is pretty much the amount of gas that's in a certain area. So this would be a high partial pressure of oxygen, and this would be a low partial pressure. This would be high partial pressure of CO2, and that would be low. And that's what facilitates that diffusion, is how much pressure there is. Okay? So what we want to think about, though, is what's going to happen now. We have 2 formulas. So once this oxygen enters, the capillaries. It's actually going to go into the red blood cells. And red blood cells that I'll label RBC. And when it's in the red blood cells, it attaches to hemoglobin. And so a little reaction that we have there, we'd say that we have our hemoglobin normal. When it attaches to oxygen, we have our new molecule, which is oxyhemoglobin. So that's one formula you need to know. It's not too complicated. The next one's going to be a little bit more complicated, and it has to do with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide doesn't like to be able to travel in the blood. It likes to dissolve as a different component. So actually we're going to leave that for a second until we get into the internal respiration, and then we'll talk about that. So internal respiration is when carbon dioxide, so here's our cell, and here's our capillary next to it. So what happens is we have a lot of CO2 being produced, and we have little CO2. Well, maybe we should make sure we're consistent here. So this was the oxygen, and green was CO2. So we have a lot of CO2 being produced and little out here. And so what's going to want to happen is that this carbon dioxide diffuses out because there's a higher pressure inside the cell than there is in the capillary. So it diffuses out into the capillary, diffuses out, and then the oxygen that was brought in from our lungs, there's quite a bit here and there's hardly inside. Any inside because it's been used up during cellular respiration, it's going to diffuse throughout. So just as a quick recap, external going from the lung capillary or lung alveoli into the capillaries, and internal respiration is when we're going from the capillaries into the cell. Diffuses in. Okay, so what facilitates the travel between them? We already talked about oxygen. It jumps on that hemoglobin, which will bring it back and forth. But carbon dioxide has a unique, spell it right, a unique travel mechanism. Dioxide. So what happens is it starts as carbon dioxide. When it's leaving the cell, and what it does is it reacts with water, so CO2, and when that happens, it changes into carbonic acid. But it can't just turn into carbonic acid without the help of something, and we know that what helps chemical reactions are enzymes, and the enzyme that helps facilitate this reaction is called carbonic anhydrase, right? Carbon, CO2, hydrase, H2O. And this is just a quick little intermediate. It doesn't stay as carbonic acid very long. It changes right away to a new thing, which is HCO3 minus and H plus. HCO3 minus is called bicarbonate ion, and this is a hydrogen ion. So we've talked about this before. So what this does, though, is now when releasing H pluses, it's lowering that pH. Okay, so that's when we have our use of our buffers. So the reason why this is so important is bicarbonate ion dissolves in the plasma. And that's why it's so important, because CO2 doesn't very well. Okay, so it diffuses in the plasma and allows it. So we'll say bicarbonate ions dissolve in the plasma of the blood, and it allows it to be dissolved and carried all the way back to the lungs again. Once it gets back to the lungs, now we have all of this HCO3 minus, and we have H pluses that will be around because of the pH of our blood. There'll still be some H's. What happens when it gets back to the lungs? It changes back into our H2CO3 quickly, and then that changes back into H2O and CO2 with the use of our carbonic anhydrase. Okay? And now, since that CO2 is there in greater proportion, it can diffuse out of the blood into the lungs just like it did in our first picture here. Okay? So one way that the carbon dioxide travels, is as bicarbonate, as we just said. So bicarbonate. Some, not much, will travel as CO2 dissolved in the blood. Like I said, not very much gets dissolved, so we'll say very little. And then some, not much, will be, that didn't work out, HbCO2 will be attached to hemoglobin. So this is the carb amino hemoglobin. And it all depends on the situation, whether or not the acidity is high or the pH is high or pH is low, whether or not hemoglobin's around to be able to attach there. Okay? So just to summarize, these formulas here are the ones that you're going to want to know. So we have one formula, so HCO3 minus plus H plus, H2CO3, H2O plus CO2. They go either way. It all depends on what the on where it is in the location. Okay? If you're trying to dissolve the CO2, it's going to go this way. If you're back at the lungs and you want to get that CO2 back so you can get rid of it out of your lungs, it's going to go that way. This will be what we spend the vast majority of our time doing in class. So if you have any questions on this, be sure to write down one concern or one comment and at least 2 questions. And I know there's going to be quite a bit on this video. So if you have any questions, write them down, and we will see you next class. Thank you.